So we decided to bring these 13 journalists. We formed a very nice group. I was understanding that they're coming in a total hunger, as I say, information hunger. But it was not easy, because even with the Serb group, for example, the whole trip had to be in armed vehicles. These were white UN armed vehicles, which sometimes you see, because that's where the issue of safety came in. We didn't know what was going to happen and who is going to help you and whatever. I think with a great, I like in my life and my career and everything what I do, I like opening doors. So reopening door for information to Serb journalists in Kosovo, I think was a very, I think it was a good step, and it was a very important step. And later on, basically, I had to be the person sitting in Kosovo in the information office of the United Nations, helping to provide Belgrade journalists or Serb journalists from anywhere else any information, be it photographs, images, interviews, I don't know, access, other things. Now, what did we see, for example, and what did I see later on when we went? What happened in Kosovo, and when I talk about this wall, there stayed some enclaves. What is an enclave? Enclave is a tiny village, for example, 10 kilometers from Pristina. For example, when there are 150 people living, Serb. You arrive there and you see a car, obviously with a Serb number plate. But this car can't travel anywhere. You see at all. We spoke about problem of movement in Bosnia, but that's even worse. You see people who are completely cut. It's almost like a besiege, cut from everything, because they can't go out of the village. They can only go to the houses. They can't go out and buy bread. Obviously, they had Italian troops, for example, guarding them in their outfits and with armed vehicles. And they were dealing with the Italian troops to go out to the Albanian shop to buy bread and bring to them on the armed vehicle. Again, these are the images. I mean, obviously, that's what we're talking about. How are you going to work? How are you going to earn your living? How are you going to get your pension? You're cut completely from everything. This was a sad image, because that's something where you pretty much, the only thing that you can do is protect these people. But talking about any type of integration or normal life, what are you going to do with that? So I think the whole issue of enclaves gave this feeling of a little bit of a dead end and lack of solution. Now, the similar things you could see on monasteries. That's when you go to south, and there are wonderful Serb monasteries, and that's an important part of culture. But again, you could see a monastery, 7 monks, and you see 4 armed vehicles. And you see KFOR or NATO troops guarding them, and the monks, well, sitting inside the monastery, not really being able to go out. It's like suddenly you are surrounded in your apartment and you have to sit in your apartment. Anyway, for some time you will sit and you will do things, but you need also certain freedom to move anywhere to do things. That was the feelings over there. And then there were complicated issues of Mitrovica on both sides, with the bridge and with everything. And we had lots and lots and lots of stories of the Serbs who were, how should I say, even when I was in Bosnia, the Bosniaks, the Croats, the Serbs, it gets into a conversation, what do I get out of that? The Bosniaks got a country and got everything. The Croats were very unhappy because they thought that they did not get a country. Because the country was divided into 2 entities and they were mixed, so they didn't get a country. or whatever, or independence, or territory, or whatever it is. So that's why the relationships in Mostar were so much more complicated. The Serbs got something, okay, they lost whatever it is, the empire or whatever it was, but didn't get sort of very much. So it's about, so even furthermore in Kosovo, because obviously the Kosovars, and there was a feeling of happiness. I think that was a contradiction. There was a feeling of a lot of happiness on the side of Kosovars because a lot has happened. And there was a very dynamic, you know, Pristina really felt like a young place, like a very dynamic where lots of things were happening. And suddenly there was this feeling of deep unhappiness on every place. It has nothing to do anymore, or it had little to do, maybe not nothing, you know, with Milosevic or the previous things, but the fact was that those people at that stage did not get very much. Or vice versa, they were cut of any kind of viable sources of life. It was more interesting because I think adding Kosovo experience was a completely different to Bosnia. Well, as I said, it was a different field, different conflict. I think language also added to that because since the Albanian Kosovar language is a completely different group of language, that's where you also felt, you know, if in Bosnia you were arguing, is it a Croat or whatever, or a Bosniak or a Serb, not just alphabet but word, for example, the bread would be kruk in in Croatian, hleb, like almost Russian word and they were digging out those words which has different origins. So obviously Albanian and Serb is a wall. It's two groups of languages. They have nothing to do. There is not a single interaction. So there was this Balkan panorama kind of shaping up. Because you go to Croatia, you go to Slovenia, also went there to have a look, and you see this green, peaceful place, which fortunately, you know, anyway, was the first one to drop, and more peacefully, you see the totally torn Bosnia with 4 million displaced people out of 4 million, so basically 2 million out of 4 million, so basically 50%, and with this, you know, cultural mix. You see Kosovo with this, you know, very dynamic development and a lucky one for Kosovars. I think that's the story, a lucky one. And to be honest, looking at that from my perspective, you could also understand that a lot was determined by the circumstances. It's against Bosnian background that the independence happened. I don't know, probably in some other circumstances it would have developed in a different way, but here everybody was so afraid of the repetition of some other things which were not prevented early or not prevented in time, that things happened. But there was this big issue of this dead end of the Serb issue in Kosovo, which obviously did follow me. Because it's also true. This experience was unique because I think in terms of professional feelings, I think it was even, you know, you get kind of partial experiences in other places, but here was with this need of the international community, or whoever you call, with this need to do the whole country, to do the whole government, to deal with all issues at all, it was a very full experience, with a slightly Latin American angle, as I told you, because of this company where I lived, which was a lot of fun and a lot of community, almost Soviet style. And a lot of leftish Latin American perspectives, because Latin Americans are very often kind of on the left side of thought. Once we also, with the Balkan experience, once we also, to be honest with you, escaped to Greece with a friend of mine. Well, it's not very far. Greece and Macedonia are not very far. Escape because there was still a procedure. It was fairly safe, but there was a procedure that we had to let somebody know, but we decided to go for 2 days. It was a weekend or something. So it was really interesting because driving, we were also escaping to Montenegro. That's another part. Well, I mean, not escaping, but there was like a bus which was going to Montenegro coast, which was going for 9 hours. It was through the mountains or whatever. And again, you get to this beautiful sea, you get to these beautiful mountains. You physically go through like a high top of the mountain to get then to the sea. And you kind of think about all that because it's, you know, and probably as a Russian, you think about a couple of things. You think that former Yugoslavia, from our perspective, from Russian perspective, you asked me when I was born, 60s, 65, grew up in 80s enclosed world, ex-Yugoslavia was an absolute dream. Ex-Yugoslavia was the most advanced, the most closest to the West. It had all sorts of things which, for example, in Russia were unbelievable. There was private sector, I don't know. There were coffee shops and there were restaurants and there were possibilities which we couldn't even imagine, to travel to the West, earn some money and come back. Well, I come back to the same issue, but there was a lot of nature, there was a lot of sea, there was a lot of mountains. And coming from the family when there was a lot of liberal thought and kind of generation of my father, my parents, who made a lot for perestroika, everybody would have thought that Yugoslavia would have been the easiest. They're Western. They're already Western. I speak about Russian perspective. So what is easier that if kind of the Soviet bloc falls, you know, it's just a Western country which just becomes Western, and that's it. They already have private sector, they already have part of private economy, you know, they know the West, they have freedom of travel. Nobody could have ever expected how it would end up. And now nobody could have expected that pretty much having everything, it could end up with so many unresolvable or difficultly resolvable latent conflicts. So it turned out to be kind of vice versa. And I guess this international experience of 3 years, it was also interesting. Well, we talked about these internationals coming and going, what you give, what you take. Of course, many people stay or get married or, I don't know, or dedicate all their life after to the Balkans. You get addicted to Balkans. In my case, I got addicted to Balkans, but I knew that I have to put a time limit because, I don't know, for some reason I decided it's going to be 3 years, because I knew that I will stay more than 3 years. I will probably stay for my life or dedicate all my life to the Balkans. And at some stage I made a decision, no, I'm going to move on. I love it, I love coming back. I love the people, I understand this, I understand part of the history. I spent this fantastic and fantastically interesting, maybe not easy, but fantastically interesting 3 years in the Balkans, but I'm going to put a time limit. I better come back after, I'm going to move. And I did move to another geopolitical conflict, thanks to the UN, which happened to be completely unexpected for me, a very unknown conflict, very important in the 90s, almost like Balkans in the 20s. I ended up going to Guatemala and Central America, and that was another chapter of my life.
So, what about afterwards? So you left, bring us to today. What did you do after so Kosovo, you went to Guatemala, then
okay,
you were still engaged a little bit in the Balkans from the Council of Europe, right?
Yeah, well, not indirectly. I mean, indirectly. Well, another question, I'll tell you that, but another question, if you want to precise any of those experiences, whatever, childhood, Russia, whatever else, America, just ask me questions and I'll, family or whatever, and I'll give some little bits. Well, as I said, after Balkans, I went to Guatemala, where I spent another 3 years, which was 2001, 2004. I couldn't, a lot in modern world is about communication, where I work, about images, about perceptions. So I landed there in the country where I didn't know anything at all. I didn't know at all that there was a civil war which lasted 36 years. Actually, it was much worse than, for example, Salvador, which is much better known, with more people who died or disappeared, etc. And I also didn't know that UN brokered a peace agreement only in '95, fairly late, when the whole world is already changed. So I really felt that if I happened to be in the middle of a geopolitical conflict of the 20th century, the Balkans, well, it was end of 20th century, beginning of the 21st, somehow it's like a time machine which takes you to the conflict, which was a big one in the 80s, but everybody forgot about it today. But that's how the world and how everything works. But it wasn't better. That was a totally fantastic experience, a completely different one, because it's another, like a wonderful orchid in a jungle or something, with all the Latin American flavor. Comparing to Balkans, a completely different, well, different conflict, but not a better one. Completely different United Nations experience, because there it was all about human rights, not about police or about government, but about human rights, so different angles. And a completely different angles, for example, when I came there, I didn't quite figure out that Guatemala has more than 50% of indigenous people, 26 languages, very rich color, and the system very close to apartheid or racism, because there was nothing, not a single law, not a single thing connected with that. I stayed there, I'm happy to tell more, for about 3 years. Fantastically interesting place and job. After that, I moved to Europe. I somehow decided that it's more interesting for me to get a European perspective, and got a job as Director of Communication for the Council of Europe, where I was for 6 years, from 2006 to 2011. And that was also interesting, another perspective, because it was all about European issues. It was all about multilateral coordination. It was all about legislation, with lots of good things. I was again dealing with communication and development of communication, PR operations, and information at large, which started developing very fast, because there was the web developing very fast, the engagement issues and public information campaigns developing very fast, the social media developing very fast. So we were all caught in this, looking for the same task which I had when I went to Bosnia. How do you look for modern communication means, in modern world? But to be honest, there was a feeling that, and that's also always a conversation. I guess it would be the same feeling if somebody talked today about Africa, or there is a developed world and sort of underdeveloped world. Not very nice terms, but there are many continents with many problems. But you can really understand that and feel it only if you went there. And we were considered as people with experience in the field. It's called the field. Because obviously those institutions, talking about UN, talking about Council of Europe, talking about European Union, it's a much more theoretical legislative work in their headquarters, with much less touch, which I think was a very big and very positive thing, with real life, which, as I was telling you, we got in places like Bosnia, Kosovo, and Guatemala. Then I did a couple of different things, dealing always with information. I decided to change. I actually went back to Russia, which changed a lot in those 20 years, and worked for a completely different project, building an innovation city and dealing with innovation, but always in communication. So my job was kind of similar. That happened in 2001, and now I continue working with 2011. In 2011. That was also interesting, coming back to Russia, seeing how it had changed in 20 years, feeling, because obviously when after 20 years you come, like Alexander Dumas, to the same place, on the one hand you know it, on the other hand you don't know it. I mean, you know how to move, you know how to drive, if you come to the same city, you know how to react to some things, you know how to park, but there are certain things, particularly in those dynamic places which I like, which changed, which you probably grasp a little less. But it was really, really interesting. And then I formed my own firm, a small firm dealing with PR, always with public relations and communication, and that's what I'm doing now. And also one thing which I wanted to tell you, I have been thinking why I ended up with such adventurous international career, which I love. Well, I mix myself. There are lots of conversations today about mix, migration, immigration, racism, and all the other things. I'm a mix of, well, I'm born in Moscow, grew up in Moscow, had all this international, became a truly cosmopolitan international person, and I guess I feel like that. But I'm also a mix. I have Armenian background. My name is Armenian, actually from Nagorno-Karabakh, and part of Jewish. My surname is Jewish, so I guess having blood of those nations kind of determines. And interestingly enough, one thing which probably less noticed, in organizations like the United Nations, which has, or Council of Europe, they have their shortcomings, they're criticized a lot, they have limitations. But I like those organizations. I think they're needed. I think, and I like them mostly because of lots of idealistic people who work there and work very honestly and try to do things. But I found that there are lots and lots of cosmopolitan people like me, not just by education or by languages. Obviously, people are hired with language skills, but by mix of blood. And I think the mix of blood, really very unusual mixtures of everybody, that I think that makes you open, that makes you different, and it makes you also see, I guess two things determined my, well, I mean three things. The sense of freedom which I got in the US, which I told you, the mix of blood which made me different, it makes you feel different, but that also makes you more sharp to understanding differences. And living through the transition period in the Soviet Union, this very fast developing, I kind of like countries in transition. I think it's one of the most fascinating things. The transitions are different. They are irrational. They happen due to many circumstances. But in transition, you suddenly have to do everything. You have to resolve it, and that's what makes it really, really interesting.
Do you want to add, you want to add something, or do you want to ask something?
Yeah, just, something which lacks or which you want to precise. Because
anything lacks.
No, we don't like it. I just you're living in Moscow now. Do you live with your parents or next to them, or?
Yeah, I live. I came back to Moscow. I came in 2011. Well, I came with this job, which I described, Vice President for International Relations for Skolkovo Foundation, which was a creation of the Innovation City. I came back. I was thinking of renting an apartment, but I came back exactly to the same apartment which I left in '96. It's funny, you open the cupboards and you see the same small papers. I collect all small papers with my notes. So they're sitting there. So at a certain stage of your life, I have a very much Dumas approach 20 years after. It's like in the US, which I came 20 years after to study to the Harvard University. And suddenly you recognize smells, noises, I don't know, some pictures or some things. So the same way now I came back to Moscow. And for the moment, I partly live in Paris, but for the moment I have been more in Moscow because my mother was quite sick, so I had to help. And I spend a lot of time. There is an apartment close to this kind of family apartment in the center of Moscow, where I lived in the 80s and 90s, like on the same, basically two apartments, but very close. But I spend a lot of time in my parents' apartments, which is my, well, not exactly childhood, but kind of youth, full of the same objects, same memories, same small papers.
You were involved briefly also in helping your father setting up a new magazine, right?
No.
The old one, I don't quite remember.
No, I mean, I was helping a lot, but the story of my father, where I told you that he was specialist in the US, a correspondent for Komsomolskaya, which was a very liberal paper at those times in 75, 76, with a whole culture to write with what is called Aesop language. So kind of formulating things not a very direct way, but understandable. Then for a couple of years, he had very difficult times in Russia. Not being published, not really allowing kind of, you know, separated from all the necessary things, but he's a strong person, he survived. And then slowly, in sort of a bureaucratic, also irrational way, he was coming back. What I call bureaucratic because actually there was a new trend to set up newspapers then in English language. There were quite a lot of publications for the Soviet camp, which were published in languages, not only English, but also German, Spanish, etc. I mean, Cuba and Eastern Germany, and etc., etc. It's kind of propaganda tool. There was a new newspaper set up called Moscow News Information, and he was proposed, with his good English and his, again, the languages, he was proposed to be editor-in-chief there. And that was a very strange, that was a publication that nobody would care at all, but as a true journalist, he turned it into kind of a big newspaper. And later on, the perestroika came, and Moscow News became like the flagman of perestroika, #1. You know, it's one of those strange things which happened. And later on, so he worked in Moscow News, and later on, he moved to another publication, which is an analytical magazine, New Times, Новое время, which was again set up by Stalin in 9 languages, in 40, whatever, 9, I guess, as a propaganda tool. But with those, you know, times of glasnost perestroika, it turned into one of the most liberal analytical newspaper, and he was working there for some time. In the 90s till the 20s. He also had his story with the US for about 12 years. He couldn't travel, but then he came back to the US. I guess it was, if he was kind of returned to Russia in 76, he came back then in 87 or 88, 12 years later, in a very strange, again, it was some bureaucratic thing because there was some peace exchanges, because there was a new trend in late 80s in Gorbachev time of groups of people traveling and staying in houses and kind of exchange, human exchange, very nice. And that was a funny trip because he flew to JFK, of course, dreaming of New York and Manhattan image. But this group was going to New Jersey, so they were met in small minibuses with very narrow windows. He saw his beloved city of New York from this narrow window, and he was taken to Trenton, New Jersey, which wasn't the dream of his life, not even seeing New York, but it turned out in a very nice relationship of a very close friend of ours, Patricia Compton, who was engaged with the American kind of Puritan approach into this group exchanges and became a really close friend of us. But then he started coming. I mean, obviously his career was changed. He wasn't quite working. Now he's writing a book again about American literature and American characters and American things. In the 2000s, things started changing, and since the magazine was a very liberal one, there were the stories, the building, which was right in the center of Moscow, was kind of seized and captured, and the magazine had difficult times, they had to leave, but that's a completely different story of a completely different era. I told you that in Russia you live sort of 100 years, so it's like another century of another setup of rules and ideas which came into force, and another practices like economic pressure on the media and seizing the buildings, but that's another story.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.